Ladies and gentlemen, let's game into the video. Let's discuss the fact that Xbox One's 7th CPU core is now available for games developers, as well as additional memory bandwidth as well. So this is also an article, so you can go ahead and check that out, where I do provide some references and some slides, as well as some links to some other stuff we're going to be discussing in this, and go into some further detail. So you can go ahead and look at that if you want, but we'll be going through it in the video anyway. So, if you're familiar with the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, you will know that both systems utilize the same AMD Jaguar CPUs. The main difference between them is a clock speed advantage, a slight one for the Xbox One. It's running at 1.75 GHz versus the PlayStation 4's 1.6 GHz. However, the processors are both x86/64-bit. They are both in very similar arrangements. In other words, that's two modules, each module containing 4 processors. And in addition to that, they have 2 of the 8 CPUs allocated towards system functionality. So you can think of system functionality as everything from running drivers all the way down to the operating system, or even your friends list. So pretty much everything. However, over the Christmas period, there was a hacker group known as HALT. However, it's spelt H4LT, all letters in capitals, and they have leaked the Xbox One's SDK, firmware, as well as documentation. Now, this has basically proven that Microsoft have allocated or allowed the allocation of up to 80% of one of the previously hidden CPUs, if you will, to games developers. So in short, now the games developers have access to 7 of the Xbox One's CPU cores. However, not 100% of that CPU is available. Unlike the other 6, we have up to 80% available to games developers. And we'll discuss that and how that works in just a second. So previously, if you've been following the channel, or comparisons between the various versions of games, you'll notice a fairly interesting pattern on certain titles, not all titles by any stretch of the imagination. However, Dragon Age Inquisition, Assassin's Creed Unity, and Grand Theft Auto 5 do come to mind. And that pattern is thus: the PS4 may have a resolution advantage, or even an advantage in, say, tessellation. It might have advantages in, say, slight texture quality, or maybe additional objects, for example, grass or whatever on GTA 5, but often the frame rate seems to dip in certain situations, primarily when things get really hectic. Now, what many had kind of speculated, but obviously we didn't really know the facts, was quite simple. The Xbox One, because it had less stuff and lower resolution, the GPU could handle it quite easily. However, because the developers were piling more stuff on the PS4's GPU and so forth, we kind of figured, well, maybe the PS4's GPU sometimes slightly slips behind, or because the Xbox One has a slight clock speed advantage, that also may be the reason. This, just for example, happens in Assassin's Creed Unity, particularly prevalent on large vistas, or if you're running through crowds, a lot of smoke, that type of thing. GTA 5 primarily happened when you were driving really fast through busy intersections downtown. And obviously we weren't really sure of the reasons. However, this is certainly one possible explanation. It's certainly not 100% confirmed, because at the end of the day, the SDK update is fairly new. And so it could possibly be that the update wasn't implemented on those versions of the game. It's too difficult to know right now, to be totally honest. Now, back in, well, a while back, GDC 2014 presentation from Ubisoft, we saw that Ubisoft were running code on both platforms, and there was a disparity between the two pieces of hardware. Effectively, this was cloth simulation on the Xbox One CPU versus the PS4, so there's a link to this in the article as well. And then they basically ported the same simulation over to the GPU. What they found is that the Xbox One CPU had slightly better performance, but the GPU naturally was considerably slower than the PlayStation 4. And so, it's very tempting to say, hey, well, this obviously is an indication of what kind of was a prelude of what was happening. However, from what we understand, just looking at the timelines anyway, it would appear that this isn't the case, because the GDC presentation was way before the changes to the SDK, so it's likely that the performance gulf would be slightly higher, although that's very difficult to quantify because obviously Ubisoft, Microsoft, and pretty much anyone are not going to say, which kind of sucks, but they have it. Now, I feel that we do need to provide a bit of clarification here. We've spoken about the Jaguar quite a bit before, but just to get you all onto the same page, if you're not too familiar with it, primarily speaking, in most gaming situations, whether we're discussing a desktop or a console, the CPU isn't really responsible for the limiting factor. In other words, it's generally speaking not going to be the deciding factor in performance. It's generally the GPU. But obviously if there's a lot of artificial intelligence or a lot of draw calls / other dispatches to the GPU or other situations, it's possible now that the PS4 could have a slight advantage, because in effect the PS4's CPU is not quite as fast. Why? Because, well, one core is both cores are completely allocated towards system reserve, at least we theorize, because obviously, who knows, maybe in 2 days' time, Sony could release a different SDK, but we might not know, right? Because, you know, it's under NDA and all. And the second reason, as far as we are aware, at least last time Sony gave us information, they clarified that it was running at 1.6 GHz. In other words, that the Xbox One's CPU does have a slight advantage. Now, there is a slight flip side to this. As you can imagine, there's no such thing as, well, this is free performance, enjoy it. In other words, there was a reason that this CPU performance was initially off limits to the developers. The Xbox One 7 CPU cores basically meant that now certain voice commands have gone bye-bye. In other words, you can wave to them and watch them go off in the ship. Now, these are not operating system, or basically system functions. So in other words, if you say to the Xbox One, record that for me, or you say Xbox on, or whatever the command happens to be, then that's going to go ahead and work just fine. But if it's a game, if it's certain game commands, in other words, voice commands for games, for example, Rise, custom commands, that's the word I was looking for, then those will no longer function. In other words, developers have to say, hey, do we want this performance for custom voice commands and stuff, or would we prefer this for the, you know, for the performance of the game? So you got to kind of make a decision. Now, you might have noticed at the start of this video, or pretty much at the start anyway, I said a key phrase, and that key phrase was up to 80%. I did not say 80%. Now that phrase is very important, because certain voice commands do eat up a lot of processing power. In other words, if you ask the Xbox to record something, or whatever, the Xbox One will actually use 50% of the 7th CPU core, well, just on recording that item, whatever it was. So, in other words, while that's happening, you can't use 80% of that CPU if 50% of it is being allocated towards X, whatever that is, whatever voice command you've just issued. So in short, the performance of this 7th core can fluctuate. It's not something developers can rely on. In other words, you can't code a game currently based on the assumption that you're always going to have 80% of that 7th CPU core available. In other words, it just doesn't quite work like that. You can't allocate for a resource that is going to fluctuate. So, how Microsoft are basically stating this is it's going to be generally at least 40 to 50%, but can go up to 80%. Pretty simple, right? As I'm sure many of you are aware, the Xbox One's and the PS4's CPUs are effectively not RISC, they are CISC, which is Complex Instruction Set Computing. And so while the 8 CPU cores sounds really great in theory, they aren't as high performance as a desktop CPU. That's pretty obvious. They're basically low power devices, for example, for mobiles and tablets and low performance laptops. The difference is, unlike say a tablet which has 4 of them, you've got 8 in the Xbox One or the PS4. And the reason for this is quite simply the cores are quite small, they run at a very low power consumption, therefore you can put them all on a SoC and you don't really have any power constraints or overheating issues. That said, while they have definitely better instruction per clock values than the Xbox One's or Xbox 360 CPU, and they do also have various improvements like OOE, or out of order execution, much better branch prediction, which is something that Microsoft really drones on about in the documents, which, by the way, all of these things, we have gone into those really quite in depth before. If you need more information, you can go ahead and check out Postmortem of PS3 on this very channel and website, and that goes into, and you can also look at for Cell, and that goes into the differences between all of these different instructions. Suffice to say, all it really means is that the CPU is better at predicting what's going to happen. What instruction is more likely to happen, and thus it can get data more likely that it's going to use in the cache. In other words, it's going to have a better hit rate on the cache, right? Pretty simple. Now, this has been stated by numerous times by developers, including Naughty Dog for the PlayStation 4, which we've covered all of their Sinfo stuff previously, and obviously with Sony as well, for Microsoft as well. There's 2 CPU core modules making up the Xbox One's CPU set. In other words, each of those modules has 4 cores each, giving 8 total. Now, each of those clusters has its own set of level 2 cache, which is 2 megabytes in size, while each CPU core on its own has 32 kilobytes of level 1 cache. Okay, so if you're with me, there's an issue which happens if, let's say, the CPU on module A wants to access the level 2 cache on module B. What happens is you have this situation where the CPU will basically look in its own data share, its own local cache, and if it does that, it's really quick. The latency can be, well, depending, but approximately 30 cycles. If, on the other hand, it has to access level 2 cache, what it will have to do is go through the North Bridge. In other words, there's no fast interconnection between the 2 level 2 caches. So, in actuality, this could bring it all the way down to 100 cycles, which could be quite the performance penalty. To clarify, this same issue is actually on the PlayStation 4 as well. And this is something that Naughty Dog really discussed in the Sinfo analysis, just for your FYI. Now, if you need more information... Now, I did mention as well that bandwidth isn't... Sorry, the CPU is not the only thing here. The other thing would be RAM bandwidth. So, just to clarify so we're all on the same page, the Xbox One uses 2 forms of RAM. Effectively, we're discounting things such as virtual memory here. So we're just talking about the actual DDR3 memory, which is 68 gigabytes per second max, as well as the ESRAM. Now, what Microsoft have done, if the developers do choose to disable or not utilize the connect tile speech tiles, in other words, they're not utilizing these titles, connect title speech titles, if that makes sense, then what happens is basically, obviously there's no point having this extra CPU performance if you don't have the corresponding RAM, right? So in other words, the bandwidth for the memory is also freed up as well. Thus, theoretically, you can have about 1 gigabyte of extra bandwidth from DDR3. So in short, DDR3 memory bandwidth for developers goes up by about 1 gigabytes per second, which is quite nice. This could be allocated however you want. Remember, DDR3 bandwidth can be allocated for audio, it can be allocated for CPU or for GPU, so that's extra flexibility in short, which is, in my opinion anyway, great. Now, the primary difference, other side from GPU performance between the PS4 and the Xbox One, as you probably know, is the choice of DDR3 and ESRAM, as we've kind of been through. So ESRAM effectively acts as almost like a, well, I suppose you could consider it to be a cache, a fairly large when you consider area where developers can basically utilize that memory purely for the GPU. So Microsoft themselves point out that while the theoretical peak of the Xbox ESRAM's performance is about 204 gigabytes per second, in real life it's not really sustainable. apart from what they consider to be, and I quote, short bursts. According to Microsoft, you should instead plan your rendering scenarios with ESRAM running a peak of only 102 GB per second, in other words about 50% of what the peak can be, although they do point out that certain tasks, for example colour blending, you gain about 10 to 30% extra performance. So that's pretty cool in my personal opinion. One definite thing you will be spotting is this is evident as well from developers themselves. If you read, what developers are saying, if you kind of read their tweets and so forth, it's very, very, very obvious that the SDK has gone under numerous improvements. For example, back in July, you might remember when they were talking about extra GPU performance and so forth, and various other improvements from Connect reserves. But they also did some other stuff that was kind of behind the scenes and no one really discussed. For example, Microsoft improved what they consider to be typical draw index calls. The performance on that from the CPU went up almost 70%, 68% to be precise. And in the same month, GPU performance went up by an average of 3.5% on different functions. So that's actually really cool. Considering that when the initial version of this was released almost 3 years ago actually, of the SDK, way back in April 2012, it's pretty impressive. And when the console was first being released, even around the launch window, a lot of developers ranked on the system. They said, hey, this is not very good. Now, while a lot of gamers put that down to the performance of the machine, in other words, oh look, the GPU isn't quite as fast, in reality it was more down to the fact that the SDK, just to be totally honest, not mincing words, sucked. It was not very good in terms of optimization. In other words, the driver wasn't optimized, the CPU wasn't optimized, the API wasn't optimized, and so on. But furthermore, you might have heard of PIX. Now, PIX, which stands for, it's an acronym for Performance Investigator for Xbox, and it's one of the tools available for Xbox developers to basically figure out, hey, where's the performance of the CPU going, where's the performance of the GPU going, and so on and so forth. Now, it's actually kind of hard at the moment because PIX and Microsoft haven't actually really updated for the 7th core, so they can't really figure out really what's going on with it at the moment. This will be improved from what we understand. But now improvements on, for example, ESRAM residency, and so for example they can figure out, well, what's going on with partially resident resources, like what percentage of them is being used from ESRAM versus DDR3. Now, I know what you're going to say, well, that's not as exciting as like extra, memory. And certainly if this was a headline on like a website, a lot of websites, if you were to kind of have two different headlines of, performance investigator or analysis tools for Xbox improve versus just, for example, obviously we're not saying it is, but I'm just using it as an example, Xbox One GPU performance increases by 5%, which one are people going to probably be more interested in? It's obviously the 5% thing because people think of very raw kind of numbers like that, but in reality they might even end up to be very similar, because if you're a developer and you don't know what's causing issues, if you don't know, well, okay, I'm basically throwing away draw calls here, or I'm throwing away a lot of memory bandwidth on this code, but you can't even figure out why or how or what's the issue, then you're in a pretty bad position. You're basically in a world of hurt. So there's still a lot of information to analyze. But I do want to tackle one point, which is getting people really excited, and that's... let's call it homebrew, shall we? In other words, let's just not mince words and say backups. If you've been watching this channel or you've been following Xbox One development for any time, you know that the Xbox One of the reasons that a lot of developers love it is that any system can be turned into a dev kit. In other words, assuming you got authorization from Microsoft, so you set up, Murderphone 3000 company, and then you start producing Xbox One games and you already own an Xbox One, then technically speaking you already own a development kit, because any Xbox One can be turned into a dev kit. And I actually really think that's awesome, to be totally honest. I think that's pretty awesome. But you're missing a couple of things. One of them is obviously the software to do this, in other words, compile it, run it, and so on. but also the instructions. Now, we actually have these leaked, so we actually have the server-side authentication, however, that's standing in the way. In other words, you can think of it like this: without server-side authentication, none of this matters, and the Xbox One, for all intents and purposes, is still as secure as it ever was. So yes, you can now write Xbox One code. It could be the best code you ever did write. You could actually compile the code, but that's it. You can basically think of it as having a PC. You've just built a PC, but you don't have a USB drive for whatever reason. You don't have a thumb drive to make it, boot it from, and you don't have a DVD drive. Let's just say, for example, your DVD drive's fallen over, and so you have no way of installing an operating system onto that PC, right? It's pretty much the same thing, slightly different, of course, but still. So what does that mean for the Xbox One? Well, obviously there are going to be some other improvements coming. We know that DirectX 12 is going to be coming to the machine. We know some instructions are already DX12 based, but certainly not the vast majority, and this is obviously going to be large performance increases in other ways as well. This is really great. I mean, it's not going to mean that, the Xbox One and the PS4 are going to have GPU parity or anything like that, but what it will mean is that as the years go on, the machines are still going to have a trick. Sony are also have a history of improving performance of their hardware. You might recall that, I believe it was the Vita, had quite a large performance increase, as if you weren't running Wi-Fi, that happened. And then there was memory on the PS3, where extra system RAM was basically freed up, and so that was pretty nice as well, because quite simply put, previously developers just didn't have enough RAM to work with, and we're talking about main system RAM, not the 256 megabytes allocated, or not even allocated, because there were two separate sets of RAM, quite literally, but the actual memory that was allocated or available for basically main game instructions, quite simply, it just wasn't large enough, and then Sony managed to shrink down the operating system, and it really improved performance. It allowed developers to produce games that, well, just perform better. They were able to fit more stuff in there, reduce loading times, and so on and so on, and clearly that's a great thing for everyone. But in the meanwhile, it'll be very interesting to see how this develops for the Xbox One. I personally think it's really awesome, and I actually completely agree with Microsoft's decision on this one. I would have liked, to be honest with you, for them to have allowed this initially. And it does kind of beg the question what Sony are doing with their CPU allocation. I'd really like to know some of that. We can kind of guess that some of it is for recording and some of it is for the share play and so forth. And from what we understand, and admittedly Sony are being a bit cagey on this, some of their RAM is actually just pretty much being sitting idle. In other words, they're trying to figure out what direction they want the PlayStation 4 to go in, and we don't know the exact RAM quantity. I've heard some people say 512 megabytes all the way to about 1 gigabyte is basically being, well, just not really used at the moment. It's a bit difficult to know. But I would like, personally, for both Microsoft and Sony to shrink down the partitions that are being housed for basically the operating system and for not for games, and that would be quite nice as well, because obviously that would effectively reduce loading times. It would mean that you'd be able to fit more assets into memory, and, well, that would only be a great thing. But for now, anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. There will be more videos coming up, obviously, within the next few days. Originally, ironically enough, this was actually supposed to be a day I start my performance analysis on Halo 5 beta, obviously. But I figured I'd do this instead, because I was kind of, well, to be totally blunt, I got a bit absorbed in the documents. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I shall see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.